Well, we're past Christmas. We are past the shortest day of the year. And now the days start getting longer and summer's on its way. But this morning, it's cold. And we have a winter storm warning coming in. So I'm filming under my blankets. This is going to be a recap of the year. I'm going to share with you my most useful YouTube channel of the year, my top 3 books of the year, and the most significant things that I've learned in my personal life. Time of the year for the sniffles. One of the most significant things that I've learned this year in my personal life would tie into my most useful YouTube channel, and that would be therapy in a nutshell. I said in the Christmas declutter video, this Christmas has been a lot better than previous Christmases, and I think that has a lot to do with what I've learned about anxiety. I feel really bad that managing anxiety is not something that is taught in school, because I really think that I don't have an anxiety disorder. I may have said this before, but I feel as though I just created a habit of not managing it correctly. I wasn't educated well enough to recognize the beginning stages of it. And after watching Therapy in a Nutshell and learning how anxiety works and recognizing those beginning stages of it and doing some breathing techniques and reminding myself what this is, that small thing has made a huge difference in my year. Another, and probably the most significant lesson that I have learned this year is to let go. I heard someone say that having children is like having to watch your heart walk around on the outside of your body. And that is such an accurate description. I really, truly feel that. And it was probably early last summer. My daughter and I had an argument, and she left to blow off some steam, and I figured she'd be gone for maybe half an hour, and she was gone for 3 hours. And I was sitting right in this spot, and I was watching out the window, and I was petrified, really, watching to see if I could see her on the street coming home, worried what had happened to her. And this little bird landed on a tree branch out there where I was looking and grabbed my attention for a second, and it was just like I felt God say to me, what if the worst thing has happened? What if something terrible has happened to her? What good does all the worry do? I'm still in control. Even if something terrible has happened to her, even if she's gone and you're to never see her alive again, you can trust me. And you don't have any control over what happens to her anyway. She's in my hands. And at that moment, I felt a release, kind of a realization that I can try and try and try and try and try to do the best for my children and take perfect care of them and not allow anything bad to happen to them, which we all know is impossible. But no one can take better care of them than God can. And there was a weight lifted from me that day that never returned. And I've applied it in so many other situations, not just for my children, but a lot of other things in my life that I know that I have no control over. It doesn't do any good to worry about it. One of my top 3 books of the year is that going to look backwards if I do the selfie thing? Anyway, it's Timothy Keller, Walking with God Through Pain and Suffering. Moving on from my struggles with anxiety, I've also had not as much of a struggle with depression. Typically, that side of my life has been pretty short-lived, and a lot of times it does happen around Christmas and around the New Year's time. But what exacerbates the situation, if I do start to feel down and depressed, is the fact that I feel down and depressed. A friend of mine drew me to these verses in Hebrews 4:15 through 16. We do not have a high priest who cannot sympathize with our weakness, but one who has been tempted in all things as we are, yet without sin. Let us therefore draw near with confidence to the throne of grace, that we may receive mercy and find grace to help in time of need. And those verses have been such a source of strength for me, to cause me to realize and to understand that He gets it. That's why Jesus came to earth to be a human, so He could get it, so He could be one of us, so He could experience those feelings. In this book, I will read where it talks about that. This book has a different take on it. Not a running away from it or trying to get through it, but living in it and recognizing it as a part of our life. And here he says, to rejoice in God means to dwell on and remind ourselves of who God is, who we are, and what He's done for us. Sometimes our emotions respond and follow when we do this, and sometimes they do not. But therefore, we must not define rejoicing as something that precludes feelings of grief or doubt, weakness, and pain. Rejoicing in suffering happens within the sorrow. Here's how it works. The grief and sorrow drive you more into God. It is just as when it gets colder outside, the temperature kicks the furnace higher through the thermostat. Similarly, the sorrow and grief drive you into God and show you the resources you never had. Yes, feel the grief. There is a tendency for us to say, I'm afraid of the grief. I'm afraid of the sorrow. I don't want to feel that way. I want to rejoice in the Lord. But look at Jesus. He was perfect, right? But He was always weeping. He was a man of sorrows. And do you know why? Because He's perfect. Because when you're not all absorbed in yourself, you can feel the sadness of the world. And therefore, what you actually have is that the joy of the Lord happens inside the sorrow. It doesn't come after the sorrow. It doesn't come after the uncontrollable weeping. The weeping drives you into the joy. It enhances the joy. And then the joy enables you to actually feel your grief without it sinking you. In other words, you are finally emotionally healthy. This book would be excellent for anybody that wants to for anybody that's going through suffering, for anybody that knows someone who's going through suffering. And I think that's just all of us. There's a purpose behind it. And I think for human beings, whenever we can have a purpose for the suffering that we're going through, it really gives you a strength. And knowing there's nothing wrong with you for it. That was another thing, too. I was at a friend's house who was going through a particularly difficult time in her life, and she started to cry, and the reason that she was upset was not because of what she was going through per se, but she was afraid. She was afraid that others would see her suffering as a sign she had done something wrong. The second book that I want to talk about, well, this isn't in any particular order. I would say that the Timothy Keller book that I already talked about was my favorite book of the year, if you want to know which of the three was my actual favorite book. But the next book I want to talk about is Why We Sleep by Matthew Walker, Unlocking the Power of Sleep and Dreams. This was fascinating. So I think we're all under the misconception that the only purpose for sleep is to rest our bodies. And that is entirely not true. There's so much more involved with sleep. He says here, I was once fond of saying, sleep is the third pillar of good health alongside diet and exercise. I have changed my tune. Sleep is more than a pillar. It is the foundation on which the other two sit. Take away the bedrock of sleep or weaken it just a little, and careful eating or physical exercise become less than effective, as we shall see. Yet the insidious impact of sleep loss on health runs much deeper. Every major system, tissue, and organ of your body suffers when sleep becomes short. No aspect of your health can retreat at the sign of sleep loss and escape unharmed. Like water from a burst pipe in your home, the effects of sleep deprivation will seep into every nook and cranny of your biology, down into your cells, even altering your most fundamental self, your DNA. It's so interesting. It talks about how sleep has changed throughout history. It talks about how our sleep patterns change as we age. At the end, gives you ideas of what could be disturbing your sleep, things that you're doing in your life that are unknowingly ruining your sleep, the differences between NREM sleep and REM sleep. Word of caution, if you are an animal rights activist or sensitive to animal cruelty issues, there are a few sleep studies that they have done where they've used animals, deprived animals of sleep. Just to forewarn you, you might be upset by that sort of thing in this book. But I highly recommend it. It really has helped me to understand the importance of sleep and keep me from taking it so lightly. If I'm going to lose sleep on purpose, I am now, after reading this book, evaluate, is this worth the sleep loss that I'm going to have? And right now I'm studying to get my oncology nursing, and it talks certification, and it talks about the importance of getting sleep to retain information. And so if I'm going to be doing a heavy day of studying the next day, I make sure that I get a good amount of sleep before and after. They both matter, and not just the day after. I'll just leave you to read the book. And lastly, one of the most significant things that I've learned this year comes from one of my other best books of the year, 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. You've heard me talk about this many, many times. And one thing that I've been doing is I've been reading through this, and I've kind of also at the same time been reading through my Bible and finding where these principles are in the Bible. I think to tie in with this, I'm going to start by explaining a song I've never understood. There is a hymn that we sing called In the Garden at church. And there's a lyric in there that says, I'd stay in the garden with him, though the night around me be falling, but he bids me go through a voice of woe. His voice to me is calling. And I've always thought, what does that mean? And I think I get it this year. I think a lot of my focus in my Bible study, things to help me and things to help me learn about him. And not that there's anything wrong with that. I think that was, and not that I will stop doing that, obviously. That's never going to stop. But he put me here for a reason, and it isn't for me, it's for others. And so in this book, he talks about psychological error, and that really struck a chord with me. Empathetic listening is in itself a tremendous deposit in the emotional bank account. It's deeply therapeutic and healing because it gives a person psychological air. If the air were suddenly sucked out of the room you're in right now, what would happen to your interest in this book? You wouldn't care about the book. You wouldn't care about anything except getting air. Next to physical survival, the greatest human need is psychological survival, to be understood, to be affirmed, to be validated, to be appreciated. When you listen with empathy to another person, you give that person psychological air. And after that vital need is met, you can then focus on influencing or problem solving. This need for psychological air impacts communication in every area of life. When I realized that truth in my own life and how I have felt suffocated at times because I felt like no one was listening to me, it made me realize what value you bring to someone else's life by just listening to them. Not only impacts them, it impacts you. And that was what tied into what I read in my Bible. I hope you're okay with all this reading, because my learning comes from reading, which makes sense. Proverbs 20, verse 5. A plan in the heart of a man is like deep water, but a man of understanding draws it out. And I kind of got that verse when I read it, but one of my significant purchases this year were the Matthew Henry commentaries, because I absolutely love Matthew Henry's commentaries. They just explain everything to me in such perfect... Just let me read to you what he says, because it makes it so clear. It makes those verses just really come alive. Some are very able and fit to give counsel, but they're modest and reserved and not communicative. They have a great deal in them, but it is loath to come out. In such a case, a man of understanding will draw it out, as wine out of a vessel. We lose the benefit we might have by the conversation of wise men for want of the art of being inquisitive. And so we're so wrapped up in our own thoughts and sharing our own thoughts. There's these people out there that are quiet, that don't share their thoughts as readily as a lot of us. And it says we lose the benefit we might have by the conversation of these people because we're not inquisitive. We're not giving them psychological air. They're sitting in the corner, not being given the ability to share their hearts with the people around them, because no one asks. I think that's what that verse in the garden means to me now. I could sit here. I could sit here on this couch with my books piled around me and my notebooks and be studying and praying. But there's a shortage of people out there that really listen to others and really want to draw out of them what they have to say and what they have to share and what their feelings are. And you know that. You know there's a shortage of those people out there. Because I know you all feel it when you're sitting in a room full of people and you can tell everybody is just waiting for their turn to share the information that's in their head. The people that are actually absorbing the information are very rare. And I want to be that person. And I think that's the person that God is calling me to be. And so that's one of my goals going forward into the new year. That would be a perfect segue into the next video, which would be my goals for the new year. Until then, have a great night, be safe, and Happy New Year. One of my goals to do by the end of the year was to learn my first ukulele song. I thought this would be fitting to say goodbye to 2018, and I'm going to share it with you. But please remember, I said this is my first ukulele song. God be with you till we meet again. By his counsel's guide uphold you. With his sheep securely fold you. God be with you till we meet again. Till we meet, till we meet, till we meet at Jesus' feet. Till we meet, till we meet. God be with you till we meet again. God be with you till we meet again. Neath his wings securely hide you. Daily manna still provide you. God be with you till we meet again. Till we meet, till we meet, till we meet at Jesus' feet. Till we meet, till we meet. God be with you till we meet again. God be with you till we meet again. When life's perils thick confound you, put his arms unfailing round you. God be with you till we meet again. Till we meet, till we meet, till we meet at Jesus' feet. Till we meet, till we meet. God be with you till we meet again. Happy New Year. See you in 2019.